James Carter wasn't your typical CEO. Sure, he wore the suits and attended the big meetings, but deep down, he was a man who cared about more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. He had built Global Logistics Inc. from the ground up, starting as a small delivery service and turning it into one of the largest logistics companies in the country. But lately, something didn't sit right with him. Every year, James would ask his team to conduct surveys among employees to see how things were going. This time, however, the results came back with some alarming feedback. Workers at the warehouses weren't happy, not because of low pay or long hours, though those were mentioned too, but because they felt unsafe. Stories poured in about near misses, with heavy machinery, poorly stacked shelves that looked ready to collapse, and constant pressure to move faster even when it meant cutting corners. At first, James thought maybe these were isolated incidents blown out of proportion. After all, running a massive logistics operation wasn't easy. Deadlines loomed large, clients demanded perfection, and every second counted. So like any responsible leader, he called a meeting with his top executives to discuss the findings. But here's where things got tricky. His managers shrugged off the complaints. "It's just a few disgruntled workers," one said. Another added, "You can't please everyone." They assured him everything was fine, that safety protocols were being followed, and there was no need to panic. Still, James couldn't shake off the feeling that something was seriously wrong. That's when an idea struck him, one so bold that it could either save his company or blow up in his face. What if he went undercover? Not as a consultant or auditor, but as a regular employee, someone who worked alongside the warehouse staff, doing the same jobs they did, facing the same challenges day in and day out. Only then, he thought, could he truly understand what was happening on the ground. The plan began taking shape almost immediately. First, he needed training. Operating heavy machinery wasn't something you could fake, especially not in a bustling warehouse filled with towering shelves and speeding forklifts. So James enrolled in a quick crash course to learn how to drive a forklift safely. It wasn't glamorous. Hours spent practicing turns, learning load capacities, and figuring out how to avoid tipping over. But it gave him a newfound respect for the skill required to do the job well. Next came the disguise. James swapped his tailored suits for jeans and work boots, letting his usually clean-shaven face grow stubbly. He adopted a new identity, Jim Clark, a laid-off factory worker desperate for steady employment. With a fabricated resume in hand, he applied for a position at one of his busiest distribution centers, a place notorious for high turnover rates and strict productivity targets. As he prepared for his undercover stint, James wrestled with doubts. Was this really necessary? What if someone recognized him? And what exactly would he do if he discovered problems worse than he imagined? Despite the risks, he reminded himself why he was doing this: to protect the people who kept his company running. These weren't just employees, they were fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, the backbone of countless families. If their lives were at risk, then fixing the issue wasn't optional. It was essential. Finally, the day arrived. Dressed in his new persona, James walked through the gates of the warehouse early Monday morning, heart pounding. He didn't know what awaited him inside, but one thing was certain. This experience would change him and possibly his entire company, forever. Jim Clark, or rather James Carter in disguise, stepped into the warehouse just as the sun began peeking over the horizon. The air smelled faintly of oil and dust, a mix that instantly made him feel out of place. He hadn't been inside one of his own warehouses in years, not since he'd climbed the corporate ladder to sit behind a polished desk. Now, standing there in worn boots and a borrowed hard hat, he felt like a stranger in his own world. The supervisor greeted him with a curt nod, barely glancing at his paperwork before assigning him to load shipments onto waiting trucks. "You'll be driving forklift number 7, the man said gruffly, pointing toward a battered machine parked near the loading dock. "Just keep it moving. We've got quotas to hit." James nodded, trying to look confident despite the nerves bubbling inside him. As he climbed into the forklift seat, he couldn't help but notice how different everything seemed from this angle. From his office window, the warehouse had always looked orderly. Rows of neatly stacked pallets, conveyor belts humming along efficiently. But down here on the floor, chaos reigned supreme. His first task was simple enough. Pick up a pallet of boxed goods and carry it to a truck waiting outside. Easy, right? Except nothing about this job felt easy. The aisles were narrow, cluttered with stray boxes and tools left lying around. Other forklift drivers zipped past without warning, their horns blaring sporadically. No one signaled turns or slowed down when crossing paths. It was every operator for themselves. On his second trip, disaster almost struck. Another forklift rounded the corner too fast, its tires screeching as it veered dangerously close to Jim's machine. His heart raced as he slammed on the brakes, narrowly avoiding a collision. For a moment, he froze, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The other driver didn't even apologize. Instead, they muttered something under their breath and sped off, leaving Jim shaken. That wasn't the only scare during his first shift. Later, while stacking pallets onto a truck, he noticed one of the loads wasn't secured properly. The straps, holding the boxes together, hung loosely, threatening to unravel at any moment. When he pointed this out to a nearby co-worker, the response shocked him. "Don't worry about it," the guy said dismissively. "If it falls, we'll fix it later. Just get it done." Jim hesitated, torn between following orders and doing what felt right. In the end, he decided to take an extra minute to tighten the straps himself. It might have cost him some speed points, but the thought of those boxes tumbling onto someone kept him awake long after his shift ended. As the hours dragged on, Jim started picking up bits and pieces of conversation from the people around him. During breaks, workers gathered in small groups, swapping stories over coffee or energy drinks. Some joked about close calls, laughing nervously as if trying to mask their fear. Others complained bitterly about the relentless pressure to meet unrealistic targets. "They don't care if we break our backs," one older worker grumbled, rubbing his sore shoulders. "All they want is numbers. You mess up, you're out. No excuses." Jim listened quietly, pretending to sip his lukewarm coffee. He wanted to ask questions, to dig deeper, but he knew better than to draw attention to himself. Instead, he nodded, sympathetically letting them vent while storing away every word they said. One story stuck with him more than the others. A younger worker described how a colleague had recently injured his foot when a poorly stacked pallet toppled over. According to him, the incident wasn't reported officially. "They told him to go home and rest it off," the worker explained, bitterly. "No doctor, no paperwork. Said it would look bad for the company." The words hit Jim like a punch to the gut. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern. And worse, they were happening because of decisions made far above these workers' heads. Decisions, he realized guiltily, that ultimately traced back to him. By the time his first shift ended, Jim was exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. Every muscle in his body ached from hours of maneuvering the heavy forklift, but the real weight rested on his conscience. This wasn't just a chaotic workplace, it was a ticking time bomb. Unsafe practices, ignored warnings, and a culture of silence, all ingredients for disaster. As he drove home that evening, still wearing his dusty work clothes, Jim replayed the day's events in his mind. He couldn't unsee the reckless behavior, the lack of communication, the sheer disregard for safety. What bothered him most, though, was the resignation in the workers' voices. They weren't surprised by the dangers, they expected them. To them, this was normal. But to Jim, it was anything but normal. And as he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he resolved to push harder, dig deeper, and uncover the truth. Because if he didn't, who would? By the middle of the week, Jim was starting to get the hang of things, or at least he thought he was. Operating the forklift had become less intimidating, and he'd memorized most of the shortcuts around the warehouse. But just when he started, feeling like he could blend in, the cracks in the system began to widen right before his eyes. It wasn't just one thing, it was everything. Every corner of the warehouse seemed to echo with signs of neglect. Equipment that should have been, retired years ago, groaned under the strain of daily use. Forklifts sputtered and coughed as if begging for mercy. Chains on the pulley systems rattled ominously, their rusted links threatening to snap at any moment. And yet, no one stopped to fix anything unless it completely broke down. One morning, Jim noticed a puddle of hydraulic fluid pooling beneath his forklift. It wasn't a small leak. This was serious. He flagged down the supervisor during a rare moment when the man wasn't barking orders or glued to his clipboard. "Hey, this machine is leaking pretty bad," Jim said cautiously. "Shouldn't we get it checked out?" The supervisor barely glanced at the puddle before waving him off. "We can't afford downtime," he snapped. "Just keep it running until it dies. Then we'll deal with it." Jim stared at him, stunned. Keep going? With a potential disaster waiting to happen? He wanted to argue, to explain how dangerous that decision could be, but he bit his tongue. Instead, he climbed back into the forklift, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he tried to push down the frustration bubbling inside him. Later that day, another incident left him shaken. A coworker, a wiry man who looked far older than his years, was using a forklift to lift an oversized load. The pallet wobbled precariously as it rose higher and higher, tilting dangerously to one side. Everyone nearby froze, watching in silent horror as the stack of crates teetered on the edge of collapse. "Lower it," someone shouted, but the driver either didn't hear or ignored them. Finally, with a loud crash, the entire load toppled onto the floor, scattering boxes everywhere. Miraculously, no one was hurt, but the near miss sent a ripple of unease through the room. When Jim approached the worker afterward to see if he was okay, the man shrugged it off like it was nothing. "Happens all the time," he muttered, brushing dust off his gloves. "As long as nobody gets squished, they don't care." Jim felt sick to his stomach. How could anyone think this was acceptable? Back in his office, he prided himself on running a tight ship, ensuring every operation ran smoothly and safely. Yet here, on the front lines, it was clear that none of those ideals were being upheld. Worse still, it wasn't just equipment failures or reckless behavior. It was the culture itself. Fear hung heavy in the air, choking out any chance of open communication. During lunch breaks, Jim continued listening intently to conversations around him. One worker talked about how his buddy had developed chronic back pain from lifting improperly, because there weren't enough staff members to share the workload. Another shared a story about a colleague who passed out from exhaustion after pulling 3 consecutive double shifts. When asked why he didn't report it, the storyteller simply shrugged. "Who's gonna listen?" he said bitterly. "If you complain, you're labeled trouble. Next thing you know, your hours get cut, or worse, you're gone." The stories piled up, each one more unsettling than the last. What struck Jim most was the resignation in everyone's voices. They weren't angry anymore. They were defeated. To them, speaking up wasn't worth the risk. Silence was safer. But then came the moment that truly broke Jim's heart. Late one evening, during a particularly grueling shift, an older operator collapsed right in front of him. The man had been working nonstop for hours, sweat dripping down his face as he rushed to meet impossible deadlines. One second he was fine. The next, his knees buckled and he crumpled to the ground. Panic spread through the warehouse as workers scrambled to help. Someone fetched water, while others tried to revive him. For several agonizing minutes, no one called for medical assistance, not because they didn't want to, but because they were too afraid of what might happen if they did. Eventually, the supervisor arrived, looking annoyed rather than concerned. "Get him out of here," he ordered sharply. 2 workers carried the unconscious man outside, laying him in the shade until he came to. Watching the scene unfold left Jim reeling. This wasn't just negligence, it was cruelty. These people weren't cogs in a machine, they were human beings with families and dreams and lives outside these walls. And yet they were treated as expendable, their well-being sacrificed for the sake of profit. That night, as Jim drove home, his mind raced with questions. How had it come to this? Why hadn't anyone spoken up sooner? And most importantly, what could he do to change it? He knew he couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, he'd have to reveal his true identity and take responsibility for the mess he'd uncovered. But until then, he vowed to keep pushing forward, gathering as much evidence as possible to make sure something like this never happened again. By the time Friday rolled around, Jim was running on fumes, both physically and emotionally. The days blurred together in a haze of grinding gears, screeching brakes, and endless stacks of pallets waiting to be moved. But it wasn't just the physical toll that weighed him down. It was the constant sense of dread. Every corner he turned felt like stepping into a minefield, where one wrong move could lead to disaster. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the warehouse floor, Jim found himself staring at a towering stack of heavy steel beams perched precariously on the edge of a high shelf. It was late, and most of the crew had already clocked out, leaving only a skeleton staff to finish up loose ends. The beams swayed slightly every time someone walked by or a forklift rumbled past, their weight threatening to send them crashing down at any moment. Jim's stomach churned as he watched the scene unfold. He knew this was trouble waiting to happen. If those beams fell, they wouldn't just damage equipment. They could crush anyone unlucky enough to be standing underneath. Someone needed to do something about it. Right now. He approached the nearest supervisor, a wiry man with tired eyes who looked like he'd been working nonstop for days. "Hey," Jim said, trying to keep his voice calm but firm. "Those steel beams over there, they're not stable. We need to secure them before they come crashing down." The supervisor barely glanced up from his clipboard. "I'll get to it tomorrow," he muttered dismissively. "We're busy wrapping things up tonight. Tomorrow might be too late," Jim pressed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "This is dangerous. Look at how close they are to the edge. One bump and they'll fall." The supervisor sighed heavily, clearly annoyed. "Listen, pal, we've got deadlines to meet. If we stop everything to fix every little thing that looks risky, we'll never get anything done. Just focus on your job, all right?" Jim clenched his fists, fighting the urge to argue further. He knew pushing back would only raise suspicion, so instead, he swallowed his anger and nodded reluctantly. But as soon as the supervisor walked away, Jim made a decision. He couldn't stand by and let this slide, not when lives were at stake. Carefully, he climbed into his forklift and maneuvered it toward the unstable stack. His heart pounded as he positioned the forks beneath the base of the load, praying the whole thing wouldn't collapse under its own weight. Slowly, painstakingly, he adjusted the position of the beams, nudging them farther back onto the shelf until they were finally secure. By the time he finished, sweat dripped down his face, and his hands trembled from the effort. No one thanked him, no one even noticed. To everyone else, it was just another day in the warehouse, a series of near misses and close calls that no one wanted to acknowledge. But for Jim, it was proof of how deep the rot went. People weren't just ignoring safety protocols, they were actively discouraged from addressing problems unless absolutely necessary. Later that night, tragedy struck elsewhere in the warehouse. A team of workers was unloading a truck filled with oversized crates when one of them shifted unexpectedly. Before anyone could react, the entire load toppled forward, pinning 3 workers beneath its crushing weight. Screams echoed through the building as chaos erupted. Workers rushed to help, prying the heavy crates off their injured colleagues, while others frantically called for paramedics. Jim arrived on the scene moments later, his breath catching in his throat as he took in the devastation. The injured workers lay sprawled on the cold concrete floor, blood pooling beneath them. One man clutched his leg, screaming in agony, while another groaned softly, his face pale and clammy. The third worker was unconscious, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. For a moment, all Jim could do was stand there frozen in shock. This was exactly what he'd feared, a preventable accident caused by sheer negligence. And yet, here it was, playing out right in front of him. The irony wasn't lost on him either. He'd spent weeks overseeing these very operations from his office, blissfully unaware of the dangers lurking beneath the surface. As paramedics arrived and loaded the injured workers into ambulances, whispers spread among the remaining staff. Some blamed the company for cutting corners. Others pointed fingers at management for failing to enforce basic safety measures. But no one dared speak loudly enough for the supervisors to hear. Fear kept everyone silent, even in the face of tragedy. Back at home that night, Jim sat alone in his dimly lit living room, replaying the events over and over in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of those workers lying helpless on the floor, their cries still ringing in his ears. Each scream felt like a dagger twisting deeper into his conscience. These were people who showed up every day, worked hard, and trusted the company to protect them. Instead, they'd been betrayed. Sleep eluded him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of the accident. The panicked faces, the blood-stained floor, the lifeless body being carried away on a stretcher. He thought about the families of those workers waiting anxiously for news, unaware that their loved ones' lives had been forever changed because of decisions made far above their heads. It hit him then, harder than ever before. This wasn't just about profits or productivity. It was about humanity. Somewhere along the way, the company had lost sight of the fact that its success depended on real people, people with hopes, dreams, and fears. And if something didn't change soon, more lives would be shattered. Determined to channel his guilt into action, Jim grabbed a notebook and began jotting down ideas. Mandatory safety training sessions, regular equipment inspections, stricter enforcement of protocols, open forums where workers could voice concerns without fear of retaliation. The list grew longer with each passing minute, fueled by a mix of anger, sadness, and resolve. But even as he scribbled furiously, he knew none of it mattered unless he confronted the truth head-on. Hiding behind his disguise wasn't helping anyone. If he truly wanted to make a difference, he needed to step out of the shadows and take responsibility for the mistakes, the negligence, and the harm caused under his watch. The next morning, as he prepared to return to the warehouse for his final shift, Jim felt a strange mix of fear and determination. He knew revealing his true identity would come with risks, losing trust, facing backlash, possibly even damaging his reputation. But staying silent wasn't an option anymore. This wasn't just his company, it was his legacy. And he refused to let it crumble under the weight of indifference. Saturday morning arrived, and Jim woke up feeling like he was walking toward a cliff. He hadn't slept much the previous night. His mind raced with thoughts of what he needed to do next. The weight of everything he'd seen and experienced pressed down on him, heavier than any pallet he'd lifted during his time undercover. Today would be different. Today, he wouldn't just observe or listen quietly from the sidelines. Today, he would reveal himself. When Jim walked into the warehouse that morning, he could feel the tension in the air. The accident from the night before still lingered over everyone like a dark cloud. Conversations were hushed, movement slower, and even the machines seemed quieter. Workers exchanged wary glances as they went about their tasks, each one wondering if they'd be the next victim of an unsafe system. Jim knew this wasn't the ideal time to drop a bombshell, but delaying it felt wrong. People were scared, hurt, and angry, and they deserved answers. More importantly, they deserved action. So after clocking in and grabbing his forklift keys, Jim made his way to the break room where most of the crew gathered before starting their shifts. "Can I have your attention for a minute?" Jim called out, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Some looked curious, others annoyed. They probably thought he was about to complain about something trivial, but Jim didn't waste time beating around the bush. "My name isn't Jim Clark," he began, pausing to let the words sink in. "I'm James Carter, the CEO of this company." The room erupted into murmurs. Shock rippled across faces as people processed what they'd just heard. A few laughed nervously, thinking it was some kind of prank. Others stared at him wide-eyed, unsure whether to believe him or not. One older worker finally broke the silence. "You're kidding, right?" Jim shook his head, pulling out his wallet to show them his ID badge, the one with his real name and photo. "I wish I was joking," he admitted, his tone heavy with regret. "But I came here because I wanted to see for myself what life is really like on the ground. And what I've seen, it's unacceptable." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the distant hum of machinery and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Then slowly, the questions began pouring in. "Why didn't you tell us sooner? What are you going to do now? Does this mean we're losing our jobs?" Jim held up his hands to quiet them down. "Let me explain," he said firmly. Started hearing complaints about unsafe conditions months ago, from surveys, reports, anonymous tips. At first, I thought it was exaggeration or isolated incidents, but nothing prepared me for what I've witnessed firsthand these past 2 weeks. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I've seen equipment breaking down because no one fixes it until it stops working completely. I've watched loads fall dangerously close to injuring someone. I've listened to stories about exhaustion, fear, and injuries brushed under the rug. Worst of all, I've seen how afraid you are to speak up because you think no one will listen, or worse, that you'll lose your job. His voice cracked slightly as he continued. This isn't leadership, this isn't care, this is failure, and it's my responsibility to fix it. The room stayed silent, but the atmosphere shifted. Suspicion gave way to curiosity. Anger softened into cautious hope. For the first time in days, maybe even weeks, the workers felt seen, not as numbers or cogs in a machine, but as human beings with valid concerns and fears. Jim didn't stop there. He outlined a plan, speaking directly to the pain points he'd identified. First, he promised immediate safety inspections across all warehouses. Any piece of equipment deemed unsafe would be repaired or replaced without delay. Second, he announced new training programs focused not just on efficiency but also on proper handling techniques to prevent accidents. Third, he committed to revising productivity targets, ensuring they were realistic and sustainable rather than punishing. But perhaps the biggest change he proposed was creating an open-door policy. From now on, anyone could report unsafe practices or voice concerns directly to senior management. No middlemen, no fear of retaliation. To prove he meant it, Jim shared his personal email address and phone number, vowing to respond personally to every message. As he wrapped up his speech, Jim looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes. I know trust isn't earned overnight, he admitted, and I don't expect you to forgive me or the company right away, but I promise you this. I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure nothing like what happened last night ever happens again. You deserve better. Your families deserve better, and I intend to deliver. The applause that followed caught him off guard. It started small, a few hesitant claps, but quickly grew louder as more people joined in. Some workers nodded approvingly while others whispered among themselves, sharing cautious optimism. One young woman approached him afterward, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she said softly. I've been scared to say anything for so long. Knowing someone actually cares, it means everything. Her words stuck with Jim long after the meeting ended. As he drove home that evening, exhausted but oddly relieved, he realized something important. This wasn't just about fixing policies or improving numbers. It was about reconnecting with the heart of the company, the people who made it run. Without them, none of the success mattered. Over the next few weeks, changes swept through Global Logistics Inc. New safety measures were implemented, outdated equipment was replaced, and regular check-ins became standard practice. Productivity dipped initially as workers adjusted to the slower pace, but morale skyrocketed. For the first time in years, employees felt valued, not just as workers, but as individuals. James Carter returned to his corner office, but he was no longer the same man who had left it 2 weeks earlier. He carried with him the lessons he'd learned driving a forklift, sweating alongside his team and listening to their struggles. And though the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, he knew one thing for certain. The company and its people were worth fighting for. Weeks turned into months, and the changes James Carter had promised began to take root. Not just in policies, but in the very fabric of the company. It wasn't an overnight miracle. Progress came in small, steady waves, like ripples spreading across a pond after a stone is thrown. But those ripples carried hope, and hope was something the workers hadn't felt in a long time. At first, skepticism lingered. People whispered among themselves during breaks, wondering if this was all just a PR stunt, a way for the CEO to save face after being caught red-handed. Some even joked that Jim Clark would show up again one day, pretending to be another undercover employee. But as the weeks passed and real action followed James's words, Doubt slowly gave way to cautious optimism. One of the first visible changes was the arrival of new equipment. Forklifts that had groaned under heavy loads were replaced with sleek modern machines designed for safety and efficiency. Conveyor belts no longer squeaked or jammed unpredictably. Even the lighting in the warehouse improved, transforming dim corners into bright, well-lit spaces. For workers who'd spent years navigating shadowy aisles, it felt like stepping out of a fog. But the biggest shift came in how people communicated. Before, fear had silenced everyone. Fear of losing their jobs, fear of retaliation, fear of not being heard. Now open forums became a regular part of the work week. Employees could voice concerns directly to managers without intermediaries filtering their words. At first, only a few brave souls spoke up, sharing stories about near misses or unsafe practices they'd witnessed. But as others saw their colleagues listened to and taken seriously, more voices joined the conversation. James made sure he attended these meetings whenever possible. He didn't sit behind a desk or stand at a podium. Instead, he pulled up a chair alongside the workers, listening intently as they shared their thoughts. Sometimes he asked questions, probing deeper to understand the root causes of problems. Other times he simply nodded, letting them know their voices mattered. These sessions weren't perfect. There were still moments of frustration and disagreement, but they marked the beginning of a healthier dynamic between management and staff. Training programs also played a crucial role in turning things around. Instead of rushed orientations focused solely on speed and productivity, new hires now received comprehensive instruction on safe handling techniques. Veterans underwent refresher courses too, brushing up on skills they'd let slide over the years. Role-playing exercises helped simulate real-life scenarios, teaching workers how to react calmly in emergencies rather than panicking. Slowly but surely, confidence replaced fear. The cultural shift extended beyond the warehouse walls. Families noticed the difference when their loved ones came home less exhausted, less stressed. One worker told James how his teenage daughter had commented on the change. "Dad's smiling again," she'd said. That simple observation stuck with him. It reminded him why this journey had been so important. Of course, there were challenges along the way. Not everyone welcomed the changes with open arms. Some longtime supervisors resisted the new emphasis on safety, arguing that it slowed things down too much. Others grumbled about having to attend extra training sessions or fill out additional paperwork. Change always brought resistance, and James knew better than to expect universal approval. Still, he remained firm, reminding himself of the greater good at stake. Perhaps the most powerful moment came several months later, during an annual award ceremony held by the company. In previous years, the event had been a flashy affair celebrating record-breaking profits and top-performing teams. This year, however, the focus shifted entirely to recognizing individuals who had gone above and beyond to promote safety and teamwork. When James stepped onto the stage to present the first award, the crowd erupted into applause. It wasn't the polite clapping reserved for executives. It was heartfelt, thunderous, and full of gratitude. As he called out each recipient's name, he couldn't help but notice the pride in their eyes. These weren't just employees anymore. They were heroes in their own right, standing tall because they dared to believe change was possible. After the ceremony, James found himself surrounded by workers eager to shake his hand or share a quick word of thanks. One older man approached him, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "You know," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've worked here for 20 years. Never thought I'd see a day like this." James smiled back, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But we got here together." That night as he drove home, James reflected on everything that had happened since his decision to go undercover. He thought about the risks he'd taken, the truths he'd uncovered, and the lives he'd touched along the way. Most importantly, he thought about the lessons he'd learned, not just about logistics or leadership, but about humanity. Running a business wasn't just about numbers, deadlines, or profit margins. It was about people, their hopes, their struggles, their dreams. Every decision made in a boardroom rippled outward, affecting countless lives in ways both big and small. And while James couldn't undo the mistakes of the past, he could shape a better future, one built on trust, respect, and shared responsibility. As months turned into years, Global Logistics Inc. continued to thrive, not just financially, but culturally. Accidents plummeted, morale soared, and turnover rates dropped significantly. Workers took ownership of their roles, knowing their contributions mattered. Clients noticed the improvement too, praising the company's reliability and dedication to quality service. For James Carter, the transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. He returned to his corner office, but he never forgot the lessons he'd learned driving a forklift under the radar. Whenever he faced tough decisions or challenging situations, he remembered the faces of the workers who had taught him what true leadership looked like. They weren't just employees, they were partners in building something meaningful. Looking back, James realized his undercover stint had been more than just a mission. It had been a wake-up call, a reminder that success wasn't measured by titles or earnings, but by the impact you had on the lives of others. And though he'd started this journey seeking answers, he ended it finding something far greater: purpose.